Hello there, stay a while and listen. Tonight we delve into a world where the lines between simple sustenance and profound revelry were often blurred. A time when the very act of drinking was less about leisure and more about survival, a liquid cornerstone of daily life. Imagine a time when water, the very essence of life we take for granted, was a whispered threat, a carrier of unseen dangers, far more perilous than any potent brew. This is the story of drink in the medieval age, a tale of necessity, ritual, and occasionally glorious excess. So, before you settle completely into the quiet, take a moment if you feel inclined to like this video, and perhaps subscribe. If these old echoes bring you a sense of peace or fascination, it truly helps these tales continue to find their way to new ears. And tell me, in the gentle hush of this moment, where in the world are you listening from? And what hour has found you here? It's always a quiet marvel to imagine our global circle drifting together through these narratives. Now, soften the edges of your day. Perhaps a gentle light, a comfortable space, and let's ease into the clinking mugs and hushed murmurs of a bygone era. Imagine, if you will, the early morning chill of a 13th century European village, long before the sun has fully declared its presence. You are a peasant, your muscles already aching from a lifetime of toil. The earth, a constant, demanding partner. Rivers, streams, and even many wells were open arteries of the nascent, often unsanitary, human settlements. They were convenient, if grim, repositories for sewage, for the remains of unfortunate creatures, and for all the unseen detritus of a populous era. It was, quite literally, liquid bread, a thick, often unfiltered, uncarbonated beverage that delivered much-needed energy in an easily digestible form. It was a cheaper and more readily available alternative to wine, especially in the northern reaches of Europe, where vineyards were rare. To refuse it would be to willingly turn away from a primary source of sustenance and safety. So while the idea of daily alcohol consumption from dawn till dusk might seem utterly alien to us today, for the medieval peasant, it was simply the rhythm of life, a constant, low-level hum of liquid sustenance that kept them tethered to the demanding realities of their world without succumbing to its hidden watery perils. The concept of microscopic life, of bacteria and pathogens, was entirely unknown. Yet, through generations of bitter experience and countless agonizing fevers, people had learned a chilling lesson. Drink directly from the flowing stream, and you courted a swift, often fatal illness. The consequences were immediate and severe, often leading to a rapid, undignified end, face down in a muddy ditch. Your day stretches before you, a relentless rhythm of field work, livestock, and struggle against the elements. As you rise from your straw pallet, the first thought isn't for fresh, cool water from a tap, for such a luxury is centuries away. No, your hand instinctively reaches for a sturdy wooden tankard, filled not with water, but with ale. This isn't a morning indulgence. It is the very first act of self-preservation. The truth, stark and simple, was this: medieval water could, and often did, kill you. So, the solution, elegant in its necessity, was small beer. This wasn't a potent concoction designed for inebriation, but a mildly fermented beverage crafted from whatever grains were at hand: barley, oats, or perhaps a mix, and whatever natural yeast floated in the air, eager for a feast. Its glamour was non-existent, its strength negligible, typically around 1 to 2% alcohol, but its true value lay in its inherent safety. The fermentation process, simple as it was, killed the dangerous bacteria that thrived in untreated water, making it a far more reliable choice than any seemingly clear puddle outside the cottage door. This wasn't a drink just for adults. Children partook of it, as did nuns, and even the most pious monks. For the average person in medieval times, consuming a staggering gallon of ale a day was not an act of wanton drunkenness, but a prudent, almost unconscious decision for survival. They simply did not trust the water. Beyond safety, ale was also a caloric lifeline. In an era where food was often scarce, monotonous, and prone to spoilage, ale served as a vital dietary supplement. Monasteries, those bastions of spiritual devotion and scholarly pursuit, also emerged as unexpected pioneers in the world of brewing. Far from merely serving meager rations, many monastic communities operated sophisticated brewing enterprises in the quiet confines of their cloisters. Amidst the solemn chants and the painstaking copying of manuscripts, monks were inadvertently becoming the master brewers of their age. Why them? Monasteries offered a unique combination of stability, cleanliness, access to resources, and a disciplined workforce with both time and the literacy required to document their processes. Brewing became as integral to the monastic routine as prayer or quiet contemplation. They brewed for their own consumption, of course, but also for guests, pilgrims seeking shelter, and as an act of charity for the poor. Unlike the haphazard methods of peasant brewing, monks meticulously refined their recipes. They measured ingredients, timed fermentations with precision, and were instrumental in introducing hops to the brewing process. Hops, the very ingredient that lends bitterness and preservative qualities to modern beer, was a monastic innovation. And while the common folk relied on thin, small beer, monks brewed stronger, more potent ales. This was partly due to their resources, but also a clever theological loophole. During long fasting periods, solid food was forbidden, but beer was not. This liquid bread provided essential calories and sustenance during times of spiritual loss. So proficient did some monasteries become that their brews achieved widespread renown, attracting townsfolk not for spiritual enlightenment, but for the quality of their ale. These monastic breweries, centuries before the craft beer revolution, laid the foundation for sophisticated brewing techniques that would endure for generations. Beyond the quiet confines of the monastery and the humble hearth of the peasant, there existed a vibrant, often raucous, heart of medieval social life. The tavern, long before the digital age, before reputation could be shattered by a careless post, the tavern was the ultimate gathering place. People flocked to them to gather the latest news, to share whispers. The interior of a typical tavern was unpretentious, reflecting the pragmatic sensibilities of the age. Floors were often simply dirt or covered with straw. Sturdy wooden benches provided seating, and an open hearth offered warmth and a place for cooking. Church leaders frequently decried taverns as dens of sin, echoing concerns about morality and order. City councils, with about as much practical success as attempting to regulate the flight patterns of pigeons, made various attempts to control and regulate them, yet the enduring truth remained. Taverns were fundamentally essential. They served as vital threads in the social fabric, helping to bind communities together, providing a crucial space for people to release pent-up frustrations, and offering a reliable venue for losing arguments, money, and memory, often all within the span of a single evening. The tavern keeper, a central figure in this microcosm of society, might or might not have rigorously cleaned the mugs that week, adding to the rough and ready charm. The air itself was a thick tapestry of smoke, the pungent aroma of garlic, and, quite often, the lingering scent of morning after a grind. On evenings bustling with activity, one might encounter travelling musicians, lively games of dice, or even an impromptu pig auction unfolding amidst the clinking and gossip about their neighbours. to fiercely debate taxes, and occasionally to unearth the secret excommunication of a local figure. It was, in essence, a live-action social forum, albeit one generously lubricated with beer and with a slightly, here, life unfolded in all its boisterous glory. Weddings were discussed, crucial deals were struck, and inevitable arguments erupted. And yes, within these smoky, ale-scented walls, people achieved states of proper, even legendary, intoxication, and for the fortunate or affluent, a measure of wine. Yet, patrons did not frequent these establishments for sophisticated variety. They came for the vibrant chaos, the palpable energy of communal release. In a society where the vast majority toiled from sunup to sundown under back-breaking conditions, the tavern transcended its role as a mere drinking spot. It was a place where, if only temporarily, social boundaries seemed to soften and blur. Peasants might find themselves rubbing shoulders with merchants. A local clergyman could share a bench with the town blacksmith, and occasionally, after a few too many cups, someone might even begin to spontaneously recite Latin, with no one daring to interrupt their spirited declamation. Under the unifying influence of ale, a temporary, fragile equality reigned, at least until an errant jug was overturned, at which point a different, often rowdier form of social interaction began. Taverns served a multitude of roles in medieval society, acting as both an informal office and the town's public square, just slightly lower concentration of trolls than its modern digital equivalent. The drink selection, while modest by today's standards, offered the staples of the era, usually ale, sometimes cider, of course. Not everyone looked favorably upon these lively establishments. Reflecting on the sheer raw humanity found in those old taverns, the release, the simple joy in shared company, it makes you appreciate the fundamental human need for connection, even today. It's a feeling that resonates across centuries, isn't it? If this quiet journey into the past helps you find a moment of calm, a connection to those who came before, please consider subscribing. The average village laborer consumed small beer or weak cider throughout the day. For them, alcohol was fundamentally about status. Nobles favored wine, ideally imported, often outrageously expensive. Monasteries, as we've discussed, were prolific brewers of beer. It provided a dulling balm against misery for the poor and for the wealthy. It offered a potent inflation of egos. Everyone, it seems, derived something from it. Some gained only a pounding headache and the shame of a hangover, others the stuff of legends. However, priests, for sacramental purposes, of course, primarily consumed wine, a convenient justification that often left them noticeably tipsy by the time evening prayers or vespers commenced. Yet, whether peasant or noble, a single, universal rule prevailed. Alcohol was not to be wasted. Every precious drop represented significant labor. The cultivation of grains, the arduous process of fermentation, the careful storage, and the tiring haul by someone who would undoubtedly have preferred a nap. One drank what was available, and one treated it with the respect it commanded. To do otherwise might lead to an unfortunate altercation with the local baker and a subsequent humiliating stint in the town stocks, and served in goblets so substantial they could easily double as pieces of protective head. This wine was frequently enhanced with sweeteners, exotic spices, or even perfumes. The very act of drinking something that carried the scent of an aristocratic grandmother's cedar chest was, in itself, a declaration of power and refinement. Feasts within noble courts were veritable liquid marathons. They involved multiple courses of lavish food, an endless flow of refills, and toasts so lengthy that one could conceivably sprout a beard mid-sentence while waiting for them to conclude. Becoming thoroughly inebriated at court was not just common, it was largely expected, but it was crucial that this descent into tipsiness be conducted with a certain degree of grace. Slurred Latin or wine-stained robes might be forgivable transgressions, but vomiting into a bishop's lap was a significantly less pardonable offence. This was not for the purpose of leisure or festivity, but as a direct means of sustaining life. It was a fundamental source of calories, a critical substitute for dangerous water, and, in a life defined by blisters and oppressive taxes, one of the precious few affordable pleasures. Peasants drank from simple wooden cups, crude clay jugs, or in moments of utter desperation, directly from their cupped hands. While constant intoxication was not the goal, feast days were a different matter entirely. On such occasions, one could reliably anticipate someone waking amidst a haystack, their memory a complete blank, perhaps with a lone, misplaced shoe that belonged to someone else. It's how we keep these sleepy tailies alive. In medieval Europe, the degree to which one succumbed to inebriation, and the amount of dignity subsequently misplaced, was often a direct reflection of one's social standing. Getting wasted was far from a uniform experience. It unfolded in distinct tiers, much like a precarious, unstable wedding cake with a rather sleepy goat nestled underneath it. At the very base of this societal structure stood the peasant. Ascending the muddy social ladder, we encounter the nobility. Then there were the monks and clergy, existing in their own distinct social sphere, technically bound by celibacy and occasionally by sobriety. Ultimately, drinking served as a great medieval equalizer, so as you quietly drift, perhaps you wonder, what exactly did a medieval person reach for when they sought to unwind or simply to survive? Another arduous day of ploughing, enduring plague, or contending with the incessant burden of papal taxes? The answer, as with much of history, is varied and often surprising. Crafted from fermented honey and water, mead was characteristically sweet, often quite strong, and a popular choice at feasts, particularly among those who found regular ale insufficiently dramatic. However, medieval wine bore little resemblance to the refined Merlot of modern cellars. Some individuals favored brachet, a peculiar medieval hybrid of beer and mead, often potent enough to strip paint from a wall. Others partook in posset, a truly bizarre hot mixture of curdled milk and ale. Imagine, if you dare, a frothy, unsettling soup seemingly concocted by someone with a deep-seated grievance against dairy cows. Occasionally, medicinal concoctions entered the fray. Wines infused with herbs, promising remedies for ailments ranging from persistent headaches to spiritual afflictions. Whether these truly cured anything remains debatable. But after a few cups, one can safely assume nobody much cared. And finally, for the truly audacious and those prepared for immediate nausea, there was ale mixed with raw egg. Did it confer strength? Perhaps. Did it possess an aroma one would immediately regret? Absolutely. It was frequently sour, often weak, and astonishingly, routinely mixed with herbs, spices, or even seawater. These were not the restrained, polite gatherings of polite society. There were all-night carnivals of consumption, mountains of meat, exuberant music, fervent merriment, and vast quantities of intoxicating beverages flowed freely. Getting drunk was not merely accepted. It was, in many ways, an integral, almost architectural, component of the seating arrangement itself. Feasts were convened for any conceivable occasion: weddings, religious holidays, the arrival of a royal heir the triumphant, return of someone who had miraculously survived a crusade, or simply because the lord of the manor was feeling bored and wished to parade his new falcon-shaped goblet. The notion of sipping a Cabernet that carried the distinct taste of brine and regret was surprisingly a mark of sophistication. Alongside these, we find cider and perry, fermented drinks made from apples and pears, respectively, popular in regions abundant with orchards. Sweet, with a slight fizz, these were dangerously easy to over-imbibe, particularly if one had already embarked upon a leisurely day free from labour. If ale was the dependable village plumber, mead was undoubtedly the wandering bard, with a lute tucked under his arm and an unsettlingly direct gaze. Let us begin with ale, the undisputed backbone of the medieval beverage lineup. This was not the clear, sparkling beer we know today. Medieval ale was typically unfiltered, uncarbonated, and often possessed a hearty, almost chewable thickness, brewed from the most common grains, barley, oats, or whatever meagre harvest had escaped. The pilfering rat cell came in a spectrum of strengths. There was the aforementioned small beer, light and consumed daily, providing hydration without significant intoxication. Then came the more regular ales, capable of inducing a gentle buzz. And finally, there were potent brews that, if reports are to be believed, could evoke visions of angels or inspire spontaneous recitations of poetry, sometimes both simultaneously. Next in our journey through medieval libations is mead, the drink favoured by those who harboured a desire to feel, perhaps, a touch more mythological. Then came wine, primarily the domain of the wealthy, the monastic orders, and those dwelling in the sun-drenched regions of southern Europe where grapes flourished more abundantly than moral strictures. And then, as is often the case in history, things took a curious turn. If you thought medieval people consumed a great deal on ordinary days, you should have witnessed them at a feast. The drinking commenced early, with wine or strong ale poured by the gallon, and guests were expected to participate with enthusiastic vigor. To decline a toast could be interpreted as a grave social faux pas, or even, in some courts, an act bordering on treason. Medieval records even speak of individuals engaging in mid-feast duels over whose joke was funnier or whose beard possessed greater dignity. Then came the entertainers, minstrels, dancers, jugglers, or that one individual who, after too much mead, specialized in creating highly inappropriate shadow puppets. Getting properly inebriated wasn't merely a byproduct of medieval socializing. It was often the main event, and these games served as a spirited catalyst for accelerated intoxication. These were not meticulously structured contests with scorecards and referees. No. These were activities that typically began with bursts of laughter and frequently concluded with someone having passed out unceremoniously in a bin full of all were fueled by the same overflowing pitchers. If the night unfolded favorably, one might depart wobbling, replete with roast goose and a sense of profound good cheer. Two or more individuals would engage in a spirited competition to out-toast each other, not through the elegance of their words, but through sheer brute volume of consumption. It was less about poetic eloquence and more about enduring round after relentless round without slurring one's way through the praises of the king, escote. Another timeless classic was casting the dice, frequently played for stakes of additional drinks, meager coins, or occasionally favors of a highly questionable nature. The dice themselves were crudely fashioned, often carved from bone, and the rules of the game were fluid, shifting depending entirely on which participant remained sober enough to articulate them. And if the game's conclusion devolved into accusations of cheating, well, congratulations. You had just inadvertently invented the medieval bar fight, a subject we shall, perhaps, reserve for another evening. If it veered south, one might awaken beneath the feasting table, nestled beside a jester and a shattered lute, vowing never to touch drink again. until of course, the following week, feasts were meticulously structured chaos, and alcohol served as both the potent social glue and a dangerous toasts were not simple cheers, they were elaborate rituals, replete with grand speeches, solemn blessings, and the occasional, subtly passive-aggressive poem, perhaps feeling a strange empathy for those who sought escape and connection in a mug. Then you truly understand the spirit of these tales. Sometimes, when life itself feels a bit much, it's a comfort to simply listen, to let the stories carry you. If you feel that same quiet draw, a gentle invitation to subscribe helps keep this connection alive, allowing these whispers from the past to continue. And each toast was invariably followed by more food, more drink, and, almost always, a fresh round of dubious decisions. Nobles, of course, drank from exquisitely ornate vessels of gold, silver, or carved horn, for even intoxication was a performance. Meanwhile, servants scurried about, tirelessly refilling mugs, clearing trenches, and silently, no doubt, judging the escalating chaos. As the evening wore on and inhibitions steadily dissolved, the party would often devolve into a blurred tapestry of boisterous singing, impromptu wrestling matches, and lengthy, uninvited storytelling. If you, like me, find yourself lost in the vivid imagery of these chaotic medieval nights, for those who believed modern beer pong represented the pinnacle of human civilization, allow me to introduce you to the truly chaotic realm of medieval drinking games, where the stakes were perilously high, the rules frustratingly vague, and the probability of sustaining an injury hovered somewhere around absolute certainty. One of the most prevalent pastimes involved toasting wars. Then there was the remarkably straightforward who can drink the most, the fastest. This game, while lacking a creative name, enjoyed immense popularity, while the church might sternly wag its finger at the more egregious behaviors witnessed in taverns or the occasional bar brawl. When it came to wine, that was, unequivocally, considered holy business, yet somehow always with a surplus available for, shall we say, personal reflection. Monks meticulously documented their vintages, extolled the divine quality of fermentation, and on occasion might conclude their sermons with a slight, almost imperceptible, slur. Beyond this, certain saints were practically revered as the patron protectors of revelry. Saint Bridget of Ireland, for example, is famously recorded as having prayed for a literal lake of beer to quench the thirst of the heavenly host. St. Arnold of Soissons is said to have miraculously saved thousands during a plague by sagely advising them to drink beer instead of contaminated water. Was this science? No. Accidentally correct? Absolutely. Let us consider the fundamental role of communion wine. During every Mass, the priest would solemnly raise the chalice, utter the sacred words, Christmas, Easter, and various saints' days were not solely dedicated to prayer. There were occasions for lavish feasting, joyous singing, and the warming of both soul and bloodstream with ample quantities of ale or mead. Pilgrims, weary from their journeys, often sought respite at monasteries, where monks extended hospitality in the form of bread, shelter, and just enough wine to render the next leg of their spiritual quest perhaps a touch spiritually questionable. And should one inadvertently pass out beneath the altar table, well, that was simply considered resting in the presence of the Lord. Of course, the Church did officially condemn excessive drinking. However, like many medieval regulations, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. A noble might receive a stern, disapproving sermon. A peasant might find themselves unceremoniously tossed into the stocks. A monk, on the other hand, might simply be reassigned to less liquid-centric duties. And in that transformative moment, the wine became for believers the literal blood of Christ, which he would then consume often multiple times a week, sometimes even daily. While one cannot imagine medieval priests performing keg stands in the cathedral, this ritual ensured a steady, indeed respectable, intake of wine, all under the venerable banner of salvation. Its true objective was not so much victory, but the accumulation of bragging rights and, quite possibly, the initiation of liver failure. Medieval men took immense pride in the sheer number of tankards they could empty before collapsing gracefully into a roadside hedge. In noble circles, drinking games were often enveloped in a thin veneer of ritual and courtly manners, taking the form of elaborate pledges. A noble woman might issue a challenge to a knight to drain a full goblet in her honor, a task he would accept with dramatic flourish, perhaps attempting to compose a short epic poem on the spot while valiantly trying to suppress a belch through his rhyming couplets. And of course, there were games with tangible physical consequences, precarious balance contests, dizzying spinning challenges, and spontaneous wrestling matches that erupted once someone mistook the resident minstrel for an ogre. The ultimate goal was rarely to win in the conventional sense. The true aim was to drink more, to laugh harder, and to thoroughly test the structural integrity of the local tavern's furniture. In medieval Europe, drinking was not only widely socially acceptable, it held an almost theological endorsement. Furthermore, wine was not exclusively reserved for communion. Monasteries, as we've noted, produced vast quantities of the stuff, technically for religious purposes. Even religious festivals frequently served as convenient pretexts for communal drinking. Let's be honest, in a world where beer was a safer choice than water, someone was always bound to overdo it. And while medieval society generally embraced a good feast and the cheerful camaraderie fueled by drink, there was undeniably a limit. Once one crossed the delicate line from merrily tipsy to shouting at livestock or attempting to joust with an inanimate fence, that was when the stern hand of justice, typically in the form of the town stocks, came into play. Ah, the dreaded stocks. Medieval society's ingenious blend of punishment and public entertainment. These simple wooden contraptions secured a transgressor's ankles, wrists, or neck, leaving them exposed in the village square. There they faced the whims of the elements, the jeers of hecklers, and, occasionally, the disapproving gaze of a very disappointed sheep. Being placed in the stocks for public drunkenness was far from uncommon. If you were loud, rude, had the misfortune of vomiting in a sacred or strategically important location, or decided to publicly moon a local bishop, you might well find yourself clamped into this position of public humiliation by dawn's light. The punishment extended beyond the physical discomfort. It was a deeply social ordeal. Your friends, your neighbors, and particularly that notoriously nosy blacksmith's wife, all had a front row seat to your squirming, your slow sobering, and your evident shame. Children might amuse themselves by throwing stale vegetables. Monks might mutter scripture in your direction, and someone, undoubtedly, would utter the weary, knowing phrase, "Seen that one before." Ironically, the punishment wasn't always for the act of drinking itself, but for one's demonstrable inability to handle it gracefully. Nobles, for instance, could drink themselves into a stupor at lavish feasts with seemingly no repercussions. But should a humble cobbler stumble into a pig trough after merely 3 ales, it would suddenly escalate into a full-blown moral crisis. Authorities viewed public drunkenness as dangerous, not due to the alcohol itself, but because it rendered people unpredictable. Slurred speech and stumbling were tolerable behind closed doors, but in the bustling streets, such behavior could, quite unexpectedly, spark revolts or, perhaps worse, inspire regrettable folk songs. Some towns even employed official ale tasters, whose job it was to ensure that tavern beer was excessively strong, or at least no stronger than the mayor's personal tolerance. Still, public inebriation was rarely treated as a serious crime. It was more a mild disgrace, a social slap on the wrist. You weren't a hardened criminal, merely someone who had indulged a little too heartily on a Wednesday night. And after a few hours in the stocks, one would walk away, stiff, shamed, and most likely already plotting their next, albeit quieter, visit to the tavern. And then there were the hangovers. Hangovers in the Middle Ages were precisely as dreadful as you might imagine. With the added deprivation of ibuprofen and any semblance of sympathy from your neighbours, and a mere 5 minutes later, someone else almost certainly received a mug to the face. Welcome, then, to the unruly world of medieval bar fights, where your honour, your drink, and your questionable singing voice could all swiftly land you in a heap of trouble. Taverns were, by their very nature, not tranquil havens. They were loud, smoky, pungent, and typically packed to the rafters with individuals who had spent their entire day digging ditches, shoeing horses, or locked in acrimonious debates with their landlords. Now, 3 ales deep, they were primed for conflict over virtually anything. A spilled drink, an unpaid debt, a dice game gone awry, a debate over whose beard possessed greater dignity, an insult to someone's ox, or occasionally the grave offence of someone simply looking too French, a genuine insult in certain medieval towns. Weapons, in theory, were forbidden within taverns. However, this rule was about as effective as a no-smoking sign in a 1990s bar. Daggers, sturdy clubs, even the humble walking stick could swiftly transform into improvised weaponry if an argument escalated. And if a formal weapon wasn't at hand, no matter, tankards were heavy, and wooden stools proved remarkably effective. Tavern brawls ranged from swift shoving matches to full-blown furniture-destroying chaos. Sometimes the tavern keeper would intervene. More often, they would simply observe from a safe distance, arms crossed, mentally calculating the number of tables that would require repair by morning. Local authorities generally remained disengaged unless a fatality occurred or, crucially, if someone of importance sustained a bruise. If it was merely 2 peasants wildly flailing at each other in a corner, while a lute player steadfastly continued strumming in denial, it was, essentially, just another Friday night. But should a noble or a visiting merchant become embroiled, the law would suddenly appear, and the stocks would be prepared, or worse, a fine, equivalent to a month's wages, would be levied, accompanied by a ban from the tavern itself, a punishment akin to medieval exile. Despite the inherent risks, fighting was an ingrained part of tavern culture. One entered for a drink and a laugh. Sometimes both were achieved. Sometimes one simply left with a black eye and a story too outrageous to recount to one's grandmother. One would awaken on a pile of straw, the church bells pealing with what sounded suspiciously like the trumpet of Judgment Day, to find a goat staring reproachfully, having apparently passed out in its stall once again. So, what remedies did medieval people employ for these afflictions? Primarily, they simply powered through it. Chores awaited. Obligations beckoned. There was no time to lament a head splitting open like a rotten melon. One simply muttered something about sin and staggered back into the glaring daylight. Yet some, God bless their tenacious spirits, did attempt actual cures. A popular one involved raw eggs mixed with a combination that speaks volumes about their desperation, mixing the very thing that caused the problem with something that risked salmonella. Others swore by vinegar, fennel tea, or various infused herbs, which often tasted remarkably like grass, and profound sadness, if one was fortunate enough to access a doctor, a term that, in this context, carried a great deal of heavy lifting. They would pontificate about imbalanced humours and likely proceed to bleed you a little. Nothing aids a hangover quite like blood loss, right? Some, remarkably, just continued drinking. This is no jest. The concept of hair of the dog was not a recent invention. Medieval folk reasoned, well, I already feel like death. I might as well top it off with a warm mug of redemption. The church, predictably, offered a different perspective. Hangovers were not merely physical suffering, but divine punishment. The prescribed cure was repentance, perhaps accompanied by a period of fasting. Nothing, apparently, cures a headache quite like guilt and a dry crust of bread. Honestly, most people likely didn't even categorize it as a hangover. They simply called it Thursday. But rest assured, getting wasted in medieval times certainly carried its own unique set of consequences. The key difference was, you couldn't tweet about it. You simply rose, wiped the crust of dried ale from your face, and fervently hoped no one remembered what you did with that loot. At some indistinct point in history, someone, undoubtedly, invented alcohol. Medieval drinking was by no means exclusively a man's domain. In fact, if you stepped into a medieval tavern or purchased ale from a corner stall, there was a significant probability that a woman had brewed it, sold it, and if you were particularly mouthy, might well have poured it directly onto your head. Enter the alewife, one of the most common and profoundly underappreciated figures in medieval booze culture. Alewives were not merely women who dabbled in brewing, they were, for centuries, the primary brewers. Brewing was considered domestic work, akin to baking bread or churning butter, with the distinct advantage that it could, on occasion, render you tipsy and subject you to the curses of a hungover blacksmith. These women typically brewed small batches of ale in their homes, then sold it from jugs, through windows, or from tiny, informal stalls known as tippling houses. Some operated directly from their kitchens, while others managed full-fledged public alehouses, and yes, they could indeed encounter trouble, particularly if their ale was deemed too strong, too weak, or if it mysteriously induced hallucinations and alewives were expected to adhere to local brewing laws, which, much like the mood of the inspector, varied considerably depending on the town and the year. Prices were legally fixed, meaning that if an alewife overcharged or diluted her product, she faced fines, public shaming, or the distinct indignity of being compelled to wear a paper hat declaring her a bad brewer. Yes, truly. Then there were the tavern maids, who worked within the alehouses, pouring drinks, scrubbing tables, and deftly avoiding the unwanted advances of men named Oswald, who possessed 3 teeth and an excessive quantity of meat in their systems. These women were required to be resilient, quick-witted, and fluent in the art of the insult. Some merely sought to earn a wage, others leveraged flirtation for better tips. A fortunate few even married wealthy drunkards and achieved an early retirement, embodying the quintessential medieval dream. But women were not confined to roles behind the bar. They too partook in the drinking, especially during festivals, weddings, or after a particularly challenging day of managing 8 children and an uncooperative cow. While female drunkenness was not celebrated, it was by no means unheard of. And if the ale was good and the night stretched long, a few verses of bawdy song were absolutely fair game. In the Middle Ages, if you were ill, injured, or even just looked mildly uncomfortable, someone, somewhere, was inevitably going to hand you alcohol. Perhaps it was a priest, or your local barber surgeon, or even your grandmother. But rest assured, the prevailing medieval solution to nearly any affliction was have a drink. And in fairness it occasionally offered some relief, not because alcohol possessed genuine curative properties, but because, when you are dizzy, feverish or bleeding profusely from a jousting mishap, a few cups of wine can indeed take the edge off. Welcome to medieval medicine, where alcohol served as a painkiller, an antiseptic, a sedative, and, on occasion, even breakfast. Doctors, and once again, that term is doing a considerable amount of heavy lifting here. Routinely prescribed wine and ale, a cold, warm wine, a headache, wine with mint, digestive issues, mead mixed with herbs, served in what was essentially a hollowed-out medieval mug, accompanied by a prayer. Even monks brewed herbal liqueurs specifically for healing purposes. These were potent, sweet, syrupy concoctions flavored with wormwood, sage, or whatever botanicals seemed vaguely medicinal from the monastery garden. Today, we might label such a drink a digestive. Back then, it was simply medicine, and one could only hope for the best. A particularly audacious remedy involved soaking herbs in brandy, then ingesting the mixture to cleanse the humours. Whether it cleansed anything beyond one's self-respect is debatable, but it did effectively cease complaints, either through numbing relief or outright unconsciousness. In the grim reality of battlefield medicine, alcohol held a truly practical, if brutal, purpose. It cleaned wounds, or, more accurately, it stung like absolute hell, serving as a jarring distraction from the individual sawing off your leg with what appeared to be a repurposed farming tool. Sometimes, the patient was administered a strong drink before an amputation. Sometimes, they were the patient, and the bottle was simply passed around. But medieval people's reliance on alcohol wasn't limited to injuries. It was prescribed for melancholia, the insidious symptoms of plague, recovery from childbirth, and profound spiritual despair. If you were drawing breath, there was likely a bottle involved. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it exacerbate things? Also, occasionally. But in an era where bloodletting was considered cutting-edge science and leeches were practically esteemed colleagues, alcohol, at the very least, offered a pleasantly incorrect solution. If there is one undeniable truth about human governance, it is its remarkable ability to pinpoint when people are enjoying themselves and swiftly devise a method to tax it. And in medieval Europe, alcohol was no exception to this timeless rule. In some places, it might be a formally stamped document. In others, merely a verbal agreement with the local bailiff, perhaps secured with a sack of onions as collateral. But to serve ale without permission could lead to swift fines, public shaming, or a shutdown faster than a poorly executed lute solo. Prices, too, were regulated. That's right, price caps on beer. Authorities would post ale prices on wooden boards, and alewives or tavern keepers who dared to overcharge were, in theory, punished. In practice, if your ale was potent and your cousin held a position in the mayor's office, things tended to become remarkably flexible. And then came the taxes. Ale taxes, wine taxes, malt taxes. In some locales, there were even taxes levied on the drinking vessels themselves. Imagine being fined for using a cup that was deemed too fancy. Such was the curious nature of medieval capitalism. Monasteries and nobles, naturally, often enjoyed tax exemptions, for nothing says divinely inspired. Quite like not paying duties on your barrels of mead. Meanwhile, the common peasants remained burdened, paying levies on every batch they brewed for family gatherings, even if the end product tasted primarily of watery sadness. Yet these regulations, rather than quelling the thirst, merely spurred people to greater creativity. Some taverns operated unofficially. Some brewers sold their wares off the record. Others simply resorted to bribing the right individuals and quietly hoping no one scrutinized the ledgers too closely. The result was a booming, slightly illicit, ale-soaked economy, built upon a foundation of loopholes, gossip, and the unshakable human desire to savor a pint at the close of a long, arduous day. In essence, medieval booze was more than just a social lubricant. It was big business, and business, it seemed, was booming. Drinking was not merely a pastime. It was, in its own peculiar way, a powerful economic engine. The entire cycle of brewing, selling, and serving alcohol generated a multitude of jobs, produced considerable revenue, and, convenient, provided local authorities with yet another pretext to draft unnecessarily dramatic laws. Some towns even boasted official taste testers, whose solemn duty it was to ensure that beer was of good quality, legally compliant, and possessed the appropriate level of froth. Not a bad occupation, assuming one didn't mind the eventual onset of gout. Taverns, of course, required licenses to operate, though the definition of such a license varied wildly across regions. By the twilight of the medieval period, the very way people consumed alcohol, and indeed what they drank, began a slow, subtle transformation, thankfully with far fewer pigs wandering through taverns. Drinking was no longer solely an activity reserved for after work. It became a structured component of travel, political discourse, and even postal delivery. It's a profound comfort, this shared journey through time, knowing that these sleepy tailies can offer a moment of quiet peace in your own busy world. If this story has, in its own way, eased your mind, perhaps even nudged you towards slumber, then I feel a deep satisfaction. Your continued listening, your quiet support, means more than words can say. It allows us to keep exploring these fascinating forgotten corners of history, to bring more of these tailies to life. If you feel so moved, a subscription is the simplest way to ensure that this channel, these sleepy wizard tailies, continue to gently unfold night after night. Thank you for listening, for allowing these stories to find their way to you. May your sleep be deep, and your dreams filled with the gentle magic of history. Yes, medieval mailmen were known to drink frequently. And then came the Reformation, a profound societal shift that poured cold water and a heavy dose of guilt onto much of the prevailing revelry. Reformers like Calvin were far from enthusiastic about public drunkenness. Suddenly, drinking transformed into a moral battleground, and taverns were sternly accused of being dens of sin, sloth, and rather questionable fit. Governments tightened their grip, licensing laws proliferated, taxes surged, and public drunkenness became increasingly criminalized. Yet, the fundamental human desire for a good drink, that primal urge, never truly vanished. It simply adapted. Alewives were gradually displaced by guilds and larger male-run breweries. Wine was subjected to strict regulation by state-appointed officials. Spirits found favor and became fashionable in courtly circles. And slowly, inexorably, drinking transitioned from an everyday necessity to more of a conscious social choice. The Middle Ages receded, giving way to modernity. And while we gained the invaluable benefits of improved sanitation, cleaner water, and mercifully, slightly less meat, we also began to forget just how deeply entwined alcohol had been with the very fabric of survival, celebration, and social life for centuries. A significant change arrived with the refinement of stronger alcohol through distillation, that almost magical process that could turn wine into something capable of cleaning wounds and, just as effectively, erasing memories. This technique, gaining sophistication in the late Middle Ages, gave birth to early versions of brandy and other dangerously potent concoctions that made traditional beer seem like mere toddler juice. Simultaneously, the expansion of international trade brought exotic spices, novel brewing techniques, and eventually, sugar and rum to Europe. With each cargo of imported goods, drinking culture continued to evolve. Mead and traditional ale began to cede ground to wine and spirits, particularly among the affluent, who now sought to sip imported claret and fashion themselves as participants in the nascent Renaissance. Taverns, too, underwent an upgrade. By the 16th century, some began to evolve into inns and public houses, early progenitors of the modern pub. As these whispers of medieval life fade, and the echoes of clinking mugs and ancient revelry soften into the background, I find myself simply grateful for your presence.